Okay, hello and welcome to the Marketplace Risk Virtual Events series. My name is Martina Matthews, the Director of Community Engagement and Success at Marketplace Risk. Today, we welcome team members from Unit21, Patreon, Winolo, and Alto to present on how fraud evolves as payments enter marketplaces. Our virtual events are designed to help marketplaces and digital platforms with trust and safety, risk, compliance, and legal issues, so they can focus on launching and scaling successfully. Be sure to check out marketplacerisk.com to sign on for our newsletter subscription, view or listen to past conferences, on-demand events, or our podcast series, and you're able to stay up to date on the upcoming 2024 Marketplace Risk Management Conference in San Francisco and the 2024 Marketplace Risk Global Summit in London. Before we get started, a bit of housekeeping. This event is being recorded and will be available on demand on the website. Attendees are all in listen-only mode, and you can submit any questions in the chat. At this time, we'll hand it over to today's speakers. Priya, over to you.
Thank you, Martina, and really good to meet everyone. Thanks for dialing in. I'm Priya, I'm with Unit21, and for those who aren't familiar, Unit21 is a single platform to help you prevent, detect, and investigate any sort of suspicious activity, any fraud or other risks through a rules engine and a case management dashboard. I'm going to turn it now over to our speakers for today's webinar. Rick, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, hi, I'm Rick. I'm the Director of Fraud at Patreon. For those that don't know, Patreon is a platform that was built for funding the creator class and making sure that creators get closer to their fans and their fans help sustain them through their creative journey. And a little bit about me, I've been doing risk-related things since about 2004, so 20 years, sadly. The gray is really showing these days. And everything from fraud to content moderation to disputes, compliance, law enforcement requests, and things like that. So a pretty varied background.
Jacob, over to you.
Yeah, howdy everybody. Jacob Wilson, Director of Data and Analytics here at Alto, and the responsibility for fraud, governance, and compliance all roll up into my org. Have been with Alto since day one, so have literally gotten to launch a platform with payments on it. So really looking forward to this. A little bit about Alto: we're a ride-hailing company that was started in 2018, based out of Dallas. We are now in other markets in Texas, California, Florida, and the DC area. Our real difference is that instead of it being a platform where drivers on board and passengers come in, it's actually we hire our drivers. They have the opportunity to become full-time with benefits, all of those things. So less of the gig economy stuff, more traditional employment. But of course, fraud is a big thing, and it's very impactful, since a big part of our pitch is to hyper optimize and have the right number of drivers to meet the expected supply. Prior to Alto, I have worked in consulting and worked on quite a few different machine learning based fraud identification projects, so can also bring that experience. And then have worked in the mortgage finance technology industry prior to this. So.
Awesome. And over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Priya. Yeah, hi, everyone. I am Stephanie Horowitz, and I lead our trust operations teams over at Winolo. Some of my background: I've been in the trust and safety and risk space for over 10 years, got my start working actually on their customer support team. And I realized there that I really loved deep diving into investigations and kind of handling some of the more complex cases. And so myself and two others ended up starting their first trust and safety function. Then in 2014, I accepted a role at Lyft, and they were just kind of building out their trust and safety function. And I was there for almost 8 years before I came to Winolo in 2021 to lead their trust and safety and background check operations teams that ended up being trust ops. And so a little bit about Winolo. It's a double-sided marketplace. We're trying to disrupt the traditional staffing agency with a technical solution that's designed to match people seeking all kinds of work with companies of all sizes that need workers. Interesting kind of thinking about my background, because Eventbrite being an open marketplace, the types of cases or things that we would investigate range from behavioral fraud, fraud rings, spam attacks, mostly technical fraud. And then Lyft was much more of the physical safety. And by the end of my time there, I was working a lot in like our safety policy space. And so Winolo has been really interesting, almost as a unique combination of everything. So it has some technical fraud that we need to be wary of. It also has some of the physical stuff. And then, but it's exciting to see there's definitely opportunities for proactive levers to detect some of the more undesirable or suspicious user behaviors as early as possible.
Awesome. Thanks all for giving us that context. And I think we're going to dive right into content here. So Stephanie, I'm going to pan this one over to you first. But I'd love for you to kind of give the audience a sense of the kinds of scams and fraud attacks you see at Winolo, even when payments are not part of the picture.
Yeah, definitely. So it's technical staffing is kind of unique. So one of the big benefits is that we're working on making it much more efficient. Most traditional staffing agencies, they spend a lot of time and they have to go and interview people, and then they don't have as quite a big group of workers, and so they also lose out on maybe workers who don't need like a permanent job or can't commit to the conform schedule, and they want to be able to kind of pick up all types of work. And so we are a little bit more insulated in the fact that we actually, as a company, we're not accepting payments. Our company handles the payroll for these customers. And so in a lot of cases, most cases will be they will front that payroll for the company, and then we bill them, including our fees, after the work is performed or more continually. But that also presents its own challenge. And one recent example of something that has been going around for the same type of industry that we're in, there was a LinkedIn post earlier this year that caught my attention because it was more specific to staffing companies like Winolo, because the scam really only works in that type of model that I just explained. And it's also unique because the target isn't just the company, but more specifically the business development or sales teams that are really working on trying to drive revenue for these companies. And so I won't read the post, but basically how the scam works is the fraudsters will create like a fake LinkedIn account, and they'll reach out to team members that they know are in the sales space and kind of say like, hey, we have this huge opportunity. We need at least 10 to 20 workers. It could grow from there, but we really need to get these people started as soon as possible. We want to use your platform for them to do the work, and there's maybe a ton of upside. And so the hope is that these sales teams will kind of take that opportunity and run with it. And because they're trying to create this false sense of urgency and get those people up and running, the goal is that maybe the company kind of like relaxes on some due diligence in order to try and get them screened. But in reality, these workers are actually like not real. They kind of create some fake domains for them and probably have some offshore payment types. So the workers end up getting paid for work that never happens, and then the payroll's fronted by the company. And before the company even notices that like, hey, this person has no plan to pay us. So something I think that is really interesting about this, although it's crazy how smart they are to be able to do this, but this is so specific that you have to assume that maybe these fraudsters had some sort of background or understanding about how these companies worked and really perfected the scheme. And another issue too, especially in this economic climate where we have a lot of companies and people are really focused on revenue, they're really just hoping that they could get, kind of of prey on that maybe potential weakness and hope that people are trying to, like, people who are like on sales or like really trying to drive revenue, they're kind of maybe blinded by the opportunity and not necessarily, trying to do all they can for the customer and not necessarily thinking about the potential for this to be fraudulent. And something I think that is true for everyone in this space is that, these fraudsters really, their goal is that they're right only maybe potentially once. And as a company, we kind of have to be right all the time. And so the odds are kind of stacked against us, where we're hoping, we're trying to prevent all of these. And the fraudsters don't actually really typically have a goal that they're always going to win. They are just trying to do the scam as much as possible and just hope that somebody bites. So I think that's pretty interesting, just from a standpoint of watching how these people evolve and really just go after specific companies. And, maybe in a different economic climate where people aren't trying to like drive as much revenue in certain areas, they might have more time for due diligence. And you could see how these fraudsters respond to that in real time. It's definitely changed since COVID too. And it's just really interesting time to be in the space.
Stephanie, I have a question. Like, how much proactive searching are you doing online for ads like that might be targeting a company like yours in that space? Is there a lot of that happens?
So this was actually so the LinkedIn post was sent to me from my CEO, and I think it was just circulating in that industry. So I don't know that I'm necessarily like going out and kind of searching for this, but there's definitely other areas that I'm kind of looking into. This specific scam, while it definitely hasn't happened to that extent in that exact way that I described, we have seen like kind of like copycats in the past, very rarely. Winolo, we're much more insulated, like I said, because we don't have an open marketplace. We don't have payments that are like flowing back and forth from people submitting them and then getting payments back. So we are a little bit more insulated into like the scope of that. But yeah, I typically, there's a lot of different ways where I try and stay kind of informed. And it's interesting just to kind of see, like, you assume that unlike some fraudsters where they're really casting a very wide net, I'm assuming these kind of people are trying to cast a wide net, but it's in such a niche area that you have to kind of assume that they have more extensive knowledge into the space. So whether they were maybe somebody who was working for one of these companies and kind of figured out what happened, or if they think that, maybe they've heard from that, but I think we'll probably talk about that later in the webinar. But it's just interesting how kind of word of mouth between users ends up being how like fraud evolves, because they find out, how these things to work and really try and create something perfect for that. So you do kind of have to stay as connected in the industry as possible, which sometimes can be hard for trust and safety teams, knowing that, so the people who are probably experienced this most like you tend to be competitors. I don't know if that answered your question, Rick, but
No, yeah, totally. And just because this is an area that it's completely foreign to me, I haven't had to deal with this type of fraud use case before. But like, how have you found works best for your understanding of how all of this works? Like, what resources did you utilize in any way, or is this just something that you got into it and you started realizing, oh, these are the patterns, these are the things I'm looking for, and these are the things, this is how it has evolved since I started?
That's a really great question. And I feel like I wish I was so proactive that I was just thinking about these schemes in advance before they actually happen. But most of the time it is, we kind of are aware of a behavior because it happened on the platform or it happened to somebody else and we're being made aware of it. And then thinking about that and trying to isolate, well, what are early signals about that behavior that we might have an opportunity to capture as early as possible? And that's something that I kind of think about. Obviously, it'd be ideal just to prevent any sort of behavior from happening at all. But sometimes the entry point of where you're going to be able to find that is not maybe at sign up. It's just trying to reduce the goal to be, we're not going to prevent these people from either signing up or from doing anything. But if we can get closer and minimize how much the effect is, then we can kind of stop it. But I'm sure, as you know, being in this space, it's a lot of like whack-a-mole. As soon as you kind of like feel like, hey, we got this one. As soon as they understand it, they'll change their behavior. And we haven't, I dealt with this more at Eventbrite, but we had a little bit more opportunity to kind of detect. But as far as like the changing behavior, one of the challenges too is obviously you want to remove these people as soon as you identify it. And sometimes when you do that, that's their signal to know, okay, I'm caught. I'm going to figure out something else and maybe change some of those signals. And so sometimes the better option is to figure out how do we like prevent them from using our platform without telling them. And that's kind of where I think the concept of sandboxing a user comes in, where you don't actually tell them that they're deactivated. You just make their experience really challenging on the platform. So maybe like a perpetual loading screen, something else. They'll probably figure it out if they are a true fraudster, but there's also, if you're not entirely sure, that's a horrible user experience. So you kind of have to be really confident that this is either like a verified fraud attack or a user that you know, like, hey, this should not be on the platform whatever. And so they're not going to have any sort of opportunity to kind of plead their case, so to speak.
Absolutely. Appreciate that context and insight, Stephanie, and all the good questions, Rick. Rick, I'd love to. Oh, actually, Stephanie, did you want to share anything else? Okay.
No, that's it for me. Yeah.
Okay. Rick, I might then pass it over to you, given you've seen sort of both sides of the spectrum here, at least at Patreon, right? Fraud attacks before one-time payments became a part of Patreon, and then now kind of a different setup after payments have been sort of introduced. So would you walk us through the before and after?
Yeah, so subscription payments has kind of been our game since the inception of the company. It's always been on a monthly subscription payment kind of schema there. But recently, within the past year, we've introduced a different set of behaviors, basically, that we now have to monitor for with one-time payments. So essentially, we've kind of allowed our creators to open up a digital marketplace where they can sell items ad hoc. And instead of that subscription payment where the intention is that I'm going to come in and pledge to a creator and support that creator month after month after month, I can now go in and buy a digital product from that creator. And that presents a different type of behavior pattern for the users that with subscriptions, like you kind of expect that those fans are going to visit the page again and again and again and keep coming back to the page, where that may not be the case with a digital marketplace like one-time payments. They go to the page, they view the product that they want to purchase, they purchase that product, and then they don't ever come back, potentially. Of course, we want them to come back and keep buying from our creators, obviously, but the potential is more likely that they come and they buy one item and then they leave. So we're having to look for different types of behavior patterns within this new client base, basically. And it can vary differently from the subscription-based folks, or the behavior patterns can be the same. So there are some things that we can utilize that works for your subscription-based type customers, but also will work for your one-time payment-based users. Some of the things that we run up against, I'm sure anybody who's in any kind of fintech company that's on the call will be familiar with, but ATO always happens. Account takeover is always a thing, and every year there seems to be a new report that comes out that says ATO has gone up again this year by 22% or whatever the number is. So that's always an evergreen topic for us, is just account takeovers, looking at those aged accounts to try and evade detections, or accounts that have payment methods already attached to them that then can be utilized for the purchase of those products. And it's a little bit higher of a risk when we're talking about the one-time payments versus a subscription model, because the intent there is specifically to get that product, versus a subscription model. If you're going to gain access to that creator's backlog and that creator's current offerings for that month, and likely you'll be shut out. So the long-term benefits aren't really there with an ATO, because you're likely to be found out pretty quick. But with a one-time payment type situation, you're there to get that product. You're there to get that one thing, that targeted thing that you want from this creator. So you take over the account that's aged and has a payment method already on it, and you go and you purchase that item, you get that item, and then you bounce, and then you're done with the account. So that's a new thing that we're having to deal with. Not new, but it's definitely a different set of behaviors that we're having to deal with around ATO. And then fraud rings again. Most folks on the call again are going to be experienced in having to deal with larger scale fraud rings that are coming up, accounts that are setting up together and colluding with each other to send payments, whether it's from stolen financials or from some sort of refund fraud and things like that will happen. So that's something that we're always on the lookout for in terms of both, so the subscription model and the one-time payments model. And then the thing I think that challenges us the most in a unique way, especially among this particular set of panels, is AI generation. I think that's a challenge for a lot of folks in the fraud industry these days. But for us, it's a little bit different in that we're having to come up against AI generated art and the way that it can be used to try to fake a profile. In the past, one of the barriers to entry kind of is when you're setting up a creator page, you want it to look like you're a legitimate creator, and you want all the social platforms and social media accounts and things to kind of match suit. So it looks like a legitimate creator with a fan base. But oftentimes they didn't have the content to provide to make it look like, oh yes, I've been doing this for years and I have an established fan base. But now with AI image generation, you can build that content in less than a day and have years and years of images and content available to post in all these different things. And it's not just that you're stealing it from online, which maybe I can trace that back to its original source, and I could say, oh, all these images, one, aren't consistent looking or consistent in pattern or nature, but also I can find where they originate from, where now these are wholly original pieces of content that won't be available anywhere else. And it just adds a little bit of uncertainty to everything as we're reviewing accounts and trying to make an identity verification standpoint. And when you mix that with the folks that are legitimately using AI for these purposes of I am an AI generating artist, and this is the content that I generate, it makes it even harder now, because you can't even blanket statement that all of this AI generated content here is for the intended purpose of fraud, because you have these legitimate users that are doing it as well. So that's kind of a unique use case that we're having to come up against and challenge as we're reviewing for fraud on the platform.
Yeah, Rick, I think that's really interesting on the AI generated art side, because there are people who do use AI generated art for, they are actually doing things and using it to enhance their art. So I'd be really curious to know what sort of signals are y'all starting to think about that are good indicators? I mean, are you starting to think about it doesn't just take you posting content to your page or your platform. You really need to be engaging with your audience, or like I'd be very curious to know what y'all are really thinking about in that area.
Yeah, you're studying not only their current behaviors on your platform where you have all their information, but you are branching out and you're looking at where else are they advertising that they're a part of. Are they on X? Are they on Instagram? Whatever. What does the audience there look like? What does their interactions with that audience look like? You're looking at different aspects of the account behaviors in terms of what you're normally looking for when you're looking for fraud things, just those normal signals, but you're kind of elevating that a little bit more because you're including all of these extra searches and all this extra research that you're putting into play to make sure that everything stays consistent, basically, that there isn't some wild variables in there that would indicate that, oh, maybe this is a little bit off, or the velocity of the page views that they're getting is way out of line from what their socials is representing. So there's multiple different behavioral things that we can look at to say, like, okay, this is giving me indications of fraud here. I need to keep digging. I need to go a little bit deeper.
That makes sense.
Rick, I have another question similar to, I was really interested in what Jacob said, but kind of similar. I feel like not a day goes by where you don't hear about AI as like the best new tool and like something else is coming out. I mean, even like images being manipulated, even like the Princess of Wales is doing it apparently. But I'm curious if any like of the companies that maybe are kind of have their businesses around like these AI generators, are there any tools available to like companies who are trying to better spot that? I'm curious if they're, making available something like easily detectable that like you can know, oh, this was used using, this company's AI software or anything like that could potentially make it easier on your teams to at least, officially have some sort of source of truth.
Yeah, we're not so much worried about like whether this was created by a Mid-Journey or Dolly or whatever. So like the source of the image isn't really a concerns for us. So it isn't something that we've looked into in terms of like knowing where the source of the image comes from. For us, it's more of identification of, yes, this is and oftentimes both the non-legitimate and legitimate users are open and saying that these are AI images. So there isn't much question as to like, oh, is this an AI image of this person or is this not? There are those obvious uses of like you said, the Princess of Wales and the Taylor Swift generated images that just came out, all of that kind of stuff. And those to me are the obvious things of the downside of these AI, where you can do those types of things now readily and very easily, and it doesn't take much skill. Whereas before, if I wanted to make something convincing, I had to know how to use Photoshop, where now it's just a click, click, click on my keyboard. And so where our intersection really lies in this fraud area is more around the building of those identities to build yourself legitimately. We're all going to have to contend with AI generated information in terms of fraud attacks coming soon, if we haven't already. I know that's something across the board that anybody who's processing payments is going to have to deal with if we're not already fighting it and not knowing it right now. But for us specifically, it was more around the barrier of entry that we used to have of you have to have content to be able to provide to make it look like you are a legitimate user, where now all of that can be generated in less than a day and it doesn't have to be stolen from somewhere else.
It's super interesting. Thank you.
Jacob, I might pan it straight to you to kind of round us out here and hear what kind of fraud seems to be most prevalent at Alto. I know that payments have always been part of the platform right from day one, and so I'd love to get your take on that.
Yeah, so I'm sure pretty much everyone that's on this call has experienced some type of fraud that Alto has. Obviously, since we're not a marketplace for work, we don't have the driver fraud like other platforms can have, or like some of the gig economy apps can have. But our primary instance of fraud obviously is using stolen information to be able to get access to rides. We do also see a lot of promotion abuse, where people will ban evade to attempt to create multiple accounts and use rich promos that are designed for net new users. And account generation has actually that's actually one of my anxieties about the prevalence of AI tools. Is it's really easy to generate a bunch of fake accounts and have all of that, and then it's just up to you to plug all of that information in. So the onboarding to execution of fraud process is pretty tight and getting tighter. We have a bit of a first party fraud where it's either, hey, I didn't get the service, even though we do have proof that someone was in a car, or even with neobanks, we see a decent amount of card toggling, where there are some of these banks. I won't call any specific ones out, but some of the ones that are maybe a little bit less established and a little bit more flying by the seat of the regulations, not really implementing checks on their end, have allowed customers to essentially skirt payments by being able to flip their card that they use for pre-auths on and off after. So we've had to focus heavily on speed to prevention because I mean, it's all three for us. One, it's obviously lost revenue, which stinks. Two, any time a fraudulent user is inside of a car taking up a driver's time, that potentially impacts our supply for good customers and can increase wait times or result in no vehicle available for those customers, especially during big you can imagine concerts or sporting events or big events. You can run into that pretty easily. And then of course safety of our drivers. Usually people fraud rings. Rick mentioned them. We've dealt with our share of fraud rings. The bad thing about fraud rings when you're dealing with in-person services is usually that's not the only thing they're involved in. If they have enough stolen credit cards to become a fraud ring and then to be able to really become a problem on your platform, they're probably involved in other things. So you want to make sure that your drivers are safe and that your employees are safe in the field. So speed is really the name of the game for us. Luckily, I have, with my background, I knew that we were going to have to worry about fraud on our platform. And of course, since we had payments to begin with, it was something that was always top of mind for me. So, being part of the engineering organization, one of the things that I did was pretty much at every stage of the process, we were able to do a sanity check. And and since I am also an engineer, I was able to speak to the teams and be like, hey, I know that speeding up onboarding is great, and we want to simplify all these things, and changing the way your user flows work is really important. And we don't want to be a stage gate to that, and we definitely don't, especially in the environment today where everyone's trying to get more revenue out of and optimize. We really don't want to slow down our customers, but like Stephanie was saying, there are smart ways that you can slow them down enough to where you have those opportunities to detect, and then implementing good signals. Obviously ours is an app-based platform. We do have web portals, but primarily app-based. So we really look to using those signals since it really does relate back to a user with a location, with a phone number. All of these things are presumed to be real. But it's really easy to generate virtual phone numbers and burner email addresses and burner phone numbers. So we have to go off of additional signals and implement those things from day one on the platform. So our biggest push is getting the right signals from a user that's potentially fraudulent so that we can run that through our platforms and check.
Jacob, I have a question just going back quick to, because I know it's something that I know we deal with, and I'm sure everybody on the call has to deal with, but first party fraud is a problem, I think, across the board. How is that representing to you in your business? Like for us, it's generally, through a chargeback or something like that. So how does that present to you in your business line?
For the most part, it's chargebacks. We do have we will have quote unquote good customers that also are promo shoppers. They will go and find every promo code that ever gets posted. So we have a little bit of that on that I would lump into the first party world, but it is primarily chargebacks. And we actually, luckily, because we're doing physical services and we have other hardware for safety in the cars, we actually have a really decent win back rate on our chargebacks because building a case and presenting our case is usually pretty easy. When you drop somebody off at either their home or their office, and then you respond with, "Hey, we dropped a human being off that looks like this that did ride in our vehicle from location A to location B." That's pretty easy. But the hard thing there is obviously being able to respond to those quickly enough and build the cases, and also just try to disincent that sort of behavior. So we, where I think some platforms may be a little bit less aggressive about temporary suspensions, we tend to be more aggressive about temporary suspensions because then that also brings the person back to the table. One other like slight variant of first party fraud that we see is obviously in certain cases families will share accounts or corporation, because we do have a B2B side to our business as well, they'll have someone within their organization trying to sneak in rides or things like that. So in those cases, we have account reviews, or anytime we issue a voucher, let's say something like that, we'll both have an internal review as well as provide data back to our customers that are ultimately responsible for paying for the ride to ensure that they're covered. Yeah, those are the primary things that we see, but it is mostly just the traditional chargeback side of things. So.
Jacob, something you said kind of, I have a question that probably applies to you too, Rick, but especially related to like temporary suspensions. I'm curious how often you guys both deal with customers who maybe have done some fraud, or you're like pretty confident have done something potentially bad, but they may not be a bad customer. They might have an opportunity to kind of like get, maybe it ends up being like they just were misusing the platform and they didn't know. I'm curious how often that you guys deal with, I guess, those customers that maybe aren't as severe and like maybe have a path to be back on the platform. And is it, I guess, because I think in an ideal world, we would be so confident that every time we identify a fraudster, they are a fraudster. But I'm just curious what kind of processes that maybe you guys have put in place to try and either like make sure that give somebody like a path to be back on the platform and a warning. And how often do you guys end up seeing like that person either like continue the behavior after a warning, or do you have a pretty good success rate of like, okay, if you're at least we got them early enough where we think that they might be, potentially a customer that could use us again?
Yeah, for sure. So in our case, I mean, ultimately we care about reclaiming the revenue if we lost out on revenue, right? So I'll give a very specific instance. There was a college student in one of our markets that was really good at guessing promo codes. This was before we were a little bit more aggressive about limiting timeframes and trying not to make things easily guessable. So this person took a lot of rides for little to no money, in most cases, no money at all. And they weren't, I mean, obviously that's not great, and they are abusing things. They're kind of taking advantage more so than committing full-on fraud, depending on your definitions. So in that case, we actually reached out to the customer and said, hey, we're going to suspend your account if you keep doing this. And they're like, oh no, I didn't realize. I'm sorry. I thought it was just okay for me to, because a lot of people will think, hey, faceless corporation, it's a huge company. It's just like
Right.
Uber and Lyft. They don't care. I'm not hurting anybody, so I'm going to do this. So in that case, we were actually able to, they said, hey, here, let me pay you back for the discounts that I got. And they were actually great. So we really lean on our customer support teams to reach out to folks. I mean, the things that we look for are ban evasion, which we have
Mhm.
certain techniques and tools to detect ban evasion. If they apologize and want their account reinstated, but then they have 5 accounts sitting in wait, that's usually a no-go for us. Of course, any stolen card is an instant no-go for us. So there's no path back onto the platform if we identify that. But we've actually had really good success with our customer support teams just reaching out and saying, "Hey, we see that you've
Yeah.
been doing this." We've also used that on the card toggling side of things, because like theoretically those people, and someone could have even done it by accident. They thought they left their wallet at
Right.
dinner or when they were at the bar, so they turned their card off. They'd already pre-scheduled their ride, so it's easy for those things to happen. So we do try to provide people with paths back on, but of course, using tools like Unit21 and some of our own internal tooling, we look at the holistic signals that we get on a customer to make those decisions, and we enable our customer support teams with that.
Awesome. Thank you, Jacob. That's super interesting. I didn't even think about the promo code, like potential, like just being able to guess it, because like you said, that's not necessarily fraud, but not the way your platform's intended. Um, Rick, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that too. I'd be curious if Patreon has like similar users who maybe haven't got so severe where you're not so confident it's fraud, and like maybe is there a path to like rehabilitation, I guess, as a customer?
Yeah. So our fraud team takes care of all of our customer contacts when it comes to anything fraud related. So we actually, the folks that are making the decision on cases are also the folks that are responding to customer contacts. And at that point, we can usually suss out whether or not, yes, this removal was accurate, or no, this one needs to stay in place. And to determine basically, is there a path to redemption on this particular instance. There are definitely some use cases where we are not reinstating your account regardless of whatever the situation was, but there are several that we will go ahead and give the benefit of the doubt, let them back on the platform, monitor those accounts again to see if there is that repetition of that same behavior, that it's an issue. Use cases like first party fraud, if we get a chargeback and someone says, this was fraud, and they write into us and they say, my son, my daughter, my whatever made this charge to this creator, it wasn't me, I want my money back. Yeah, obviously that is on theirs, and we received a fraudulent chargeback. They notified their bank that the charge was fraud. We could take those accounts down and just say, nope, you're done with the platform, these are fraud. But we will generally allow those accounts back online if the user confirms that they have control of the account and the card and that they're good going forward. So there are definitely use cases where we will allow users to come back, and like I said, my team deals with the appeals process on all of those. So it's the same folks making the decision are the same folks receiving those contacts.
Oh, that's super interesting to me, because I think it definitely happens for us, but a lot of things I try and work with my team is that we at least hope to have a assume positive intent, but also as a team, like this is constantly positioned to try and catch this. Sometimes the team can kind of end up leaning towards hey, immediate removal and perm deactivation because we've seen it go wrong. And so it's definitely a balance that I try and get my team to understand of figuring out what users it might be worth that extra investment and just education to keep them on your platform, and when's the right time to cut the cord. So really interesting to hear from both of you about that.
Yeah, thanks all for sharing, and actually switching gears a little bit here, kind of I think something that the audience could benefit from hearing about is what advice you all have for detecting fraud and scams. And I know that we've kind of touched on a little bit of that already in the over the course of the webinar, but if there's any pointed feedback that you all have or any tips that you think would be good to share, I think now would be a great time. And Stephanie, I'm gonna pass it to you.
Yeah, I think one of the one piece of advice I think I just share is just identifying kind of where you might be the best opportunity to detect this fraud. And that sounds really simple, but kind of what I said before, if your goal is that you don't let anyone on the platform at all who could potentially be fraudulent, you're going to have a really small funnel and probably keeping out a lot of really good users. But if you are able to say okay, we're going to accept a certain amount, knowing that there is going to be some risk, but if we can try and catch them at this stage, whether it's onboarding or at this stage because they had to give some specific information, and cater your signals to that area, you'll have a much easier time being okay, we probably still have some risk, and maybe there might be a 5%, even a higher chance that there are people that will get on, but you'll at least be able to solve for the majority of these users and try and identify okay, are you trying to keep out the worst of the worst, or are you also is there a path to redemption for some if you think that they may just need better education? One thing that I think was interesting that I've done at a number of different companies for those users that maybe haven't set out to be fraudulent, but they just ended up doing it because either from word of mouth or they just kind of tried it, kind of like the guy inventing promo codes, is sending kind of an early education maybe before you even know whether they're going to be fraudulent. You can sometimes automate this that just says hey, we detected this change in your profile, or we noticed that you did you did this particular action. Just want to make sure that you understand what our policies are. And sometimes just presenting that information to them could be enough for them to be oh, I didn't know that was bad, and I didn't know that they were going to notice. Okay, I won't do that. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to stop attempting any sort of fraud, but for those maybe percentage of users that didn't actually intend to do anything bad, they were just maybe trying to game the system in some way, thought they found some sort of hack, you can prevent some of those from continuing on with just kind of a simple early education email.
Absolutely. Jacob, what about you?
Yeah, so my biggest piece of advice, which I've kind of already alluded to earlier, is especially in the product ideation and product design phase, start to consider the types of signals that you could use or generate as part of onboarding or payment adding or whatever the customer interactions are, where you can start to think about like, hey, how can someone take advantage of this? The thing that saved us the most in the early days was having thought about those data points that we wanted to capture at certain points in the process, and we implemented obviously SDKs and frameworks and other tools to help us capture additional data, and with that we were able to build early detection systems prior to having a tool like Unit21, but thinking about the literal flow and mapping those key interactions and data collection points out allows you to work with your UX teams, maybe to introduce, hey, if we could slow down sign up just a little bit, then we have time for this to round trip. And obviously, there's the technical aspect too. It's data has to come out of a system, be it a website or someone's app or their phone or whatever, and get back to you. And then you have to have all of your systems talk to one another. So actually looking at from an architectural perspective and architecting for detectability is a really important part of the process. And then it also gets your engineering teams and your UX teams and your business teams to think about the fraud potential as well. And I think that that was another big boon for us is, everyone in the early days, really everybody kind of had a sense for how this could happen. So even when we didn't have a fraud team and it was just myself or myself and a couple of other folks, eventually we were all able to contribute to identifying things with the signals that we had agreed to.
Awesome. Thanks, Jacob. Rick, I'm gonna ask you the same question as well.
Yeah, for me, it comes down to being the best advice that I can give is to be really mindful of patterns that are showing in the data. Oftentimes, you'll see um, the same email domain or the same name or whatever it happens to be showing up on multiple accounts, and that's usually an indication of a larger scale attack, and especially around this is something that we just experienced and are experiencing when you have a new product, a payments product launch, that's something that maybe your business hasn't really dealt with before, like ours really wasn't in the one-time payment space like we are now. um, Everybody comes out of the woodwork to test what your thresholds are, to test what your detection systems are around that particular product, and so you start seeing those patterns showing up, where, and maybe it's not a name and maybe it's not an email, maybe it's not an IP address or whatever piece of information, but there's some sort of pattern will develop, and you can leverage that pattern to find out where else are you being tested, how else are you being tested, how big is this test happening, and sometimes it can lead to other patterns that you will then discover on the other attacks that are coming in. So I definitely advise all of my folks in looking for, is there a pattern developing not only with this party but also with the counterparty? Are there patterns that are then flowing from that party that you can find other accounts that are possibly testing your system? um, Pattern recognition is one of the big ones I'll usually hammer down on.
Yeah, I think there's so many different ways that you can kind of slice this, right? And I think the biggest theme is just staying as vigilant as possible, because sometimes these patterns are hard to spot. Sometimes they're glaring you in the face, but sometimes it can really be kind of case by case basis. And I think the biggest takeaway for me here is just hearing that there's so many different strategies based on the different type of marketplace, business model, the revenue model, and it's so kind of different company to company. Last question, and then we'll kind of go over to some of the questions coming in from the audience. And I'll turn this to all of you. Maybe Jacob, we'll start with you. What do you recommend teams keep in mind as they launch and grow to ensure that fraud remains top of mind for leadership, for the business, and just the whole organization as a whole?
Yeah. I've kind of already alluded to the tight integrations of teams, but I think a big part of that is actually observability and both the accountability side of observability and transparency with your teams. So having some sort of reporting infrastructure around it, like letting people know, here is how much money we have lost in payments. If you're making a product change, like a user onboarding change, track when those things happens that you can see if there are differences. If you're lucky enough to have A/B testing infrastructure, run some tests and see if any one pattern or any one feature implementation method reduces or possibly increases fraud. But the biggest part of that is making sure that you're reporting on it and you have observability, and that is kind of open organizationally and transparent. Because when everybody sees that it's a problem, I mean, I've been part of engineering teams in the past where they're building stuff and their job is to build stuff. They have a product lead that's building a backlog for them, and they just execute on what they've been asked to do and architect things as well as they know how. If they're never exposed to it and they never think about the potential for abuse, then it's really easy to not think about something and to not design for it. And I think having that shared accountability and shared responsibility with reporting and analytics and observability really helps an organization.
Rick, do you want to give us your thoughts on this as well?
Yeah, for me, it comes down to expectation settings. So, like, what is the right mindset and the right expectation for the balance between risk and growth? Everybody's trying to grow, and some of this was touched on earlier. But is your company, whatever stage it's at, is launching this product with these risk holes in it worth the growth, or do those holes need to be plugged to launch an exceedingly safe product, because growth isn't as important at this stage of your company, and risk is maybe more at the forefront of your mind at this point. So setting those expectations with your leadership, with your business, and understanding that yes, we can totally launch this product and everything's going to be great and it's totally tight down and everything's great, but growth is going to be really, really slow because everything's so tight. Or yes, we're going to launch this product and it's risky as hell, but we're going to see so much growth coming into it that's going to overcome that risk. So it's just figuring out what is that balance between those two things. What stage is your company at? What is their risk appetite at that moment? And that may not be the same as it was a year ago, or it may not be the same as it is 6 months from now. It may be an entirely different appetite for risk at that point. So just having that conversation, setting those expectations, knowing where your company is, what the strategy is in the life cycle of your company.
I don't have too much to add there because I think Rick and Jacob hit the nail on the head. Like Rick with, the observability and making sure that you have the data and that you could share that. And then Jacob with the expectations, or not the expectation, but the alignment between, maybe switch those, but you guys got it all. I guess the only thing I'd say too, in addition to that, is just setting that culture really at the top. If your company has everyone just so focused on revenue growth and that's their only mission, then it's going to be really challenging to kind of make them either wary about fraud or even like thinking about it. So while that could definitely be the mission, make sure that those messages are kind of tied together. So if it's revenue growth at all costs, maybe just a reminder like, hey, good revenue growth. And, we want people to kind of be on the lookout for this, because eventually the losses aren't going to are going to outweigh the growth that you guys get if they're only focused on that and not preventing it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks all for sharing your thoughts. And in the last couple of minutes here, I think we have a couple of questions from the audience that I'm gonna kind of pan through, and I'll kind of pass this to any one of you who wants to take a first stab. But the first question we have up is, what trends are you seeing with seller side fraud? And how are you, well, actually, maybe we'll start there. There's a two-part question here. So start there.
I'll kind of chime in here. So on our creator side, which are essentially the seller side for us, we terminology is creator for us. But on the creator side, we do see a lot of your standard fintech type fraud that's happening with them. So there is ATO that happens where an account is taken over and their balance is drained out to an unknown payout destination. You will see creator accounts being started up en masse, and setting up fake accounts with fake information just to funnel payments through from the patron side, the fan side, that are using stolen financials to collude and send those funds through to an unknown channel. Those are going to be the major ones that we're seeing on the seller side, on the creator side for us. Yeah.
And Rick, maybe I'll pass the second part of the question to you as well, just kind of relating to that theme, right? How are you balancing low friction to sell or maybe offer services on your platform with proper controls?
Yeah, the friction piece of it is the interesting part, because you want to make the sign up flow as easy as possible, but there is also certain information that you have to collect, regardless of whether your intention is to make it as smooth transition into becoming a creator or seller on the platform. So there's a balance to strike there on how are you collecting that information, at what points are you collecting that information, how are you making it as easy as possible. Is some of the information that we're required to collect, is it stuff that we can put off of initial sign up? Can we collect it down the line? Are there things that we have to have up front before we're transacting at all? So it's understanding, one, the rules and regulations about what you have to collect and when you have to collect it, and when to introduce that kind of stuff into your sign up flow. Some of our creators will launch on platform with very little information that we have, but once they get transacted to a certain amount, we have to start collecting that information. And I think that's a common use practice throughout the industry, in terms of, especially at my time at PayPal, that was very much a balance that they were trying to strike as to whether or not we had to collect all this information before an account can start receiving money, versus we can put some of this off and put holds on the account until we get this information in. So sometimes it's easier to get the folks in the door and then ask for all that information after the fact, because there's more incentive. Now I have money in the account sitting there, I have to give them this information. So I think it's finding that balance between when do you introduce friction to the system versus when can you just let them on in and start working right away.
Absolutely.
The only thing
Yeah, I was going to ask Stephanie or Jacob if you wanted to add anything.
I was just gonna say, the only thing I'd add, I think that Rick said everything that's really important, probably has way more experience with this, is just, even if you're adding friction, if you make that friction relatively like simple to resolve, so like some sort of call to action that is easier, especially for those customers where maybe like, hey, we're not entirely sure how fraudy they are yet. If you give them some sort of easier call to action, one thing that I think is most people will especially like want to know that the company is protecting them against fraud. And so I usually advise my teams to kind of like try and include like, hey, we're here to protect your account. We're here to protect all of our users' accounts. That's why we're either asking for information, and all you need to do move forward here is just either click this button or provide these three things. So make it really simple and easy for them to respond. And the people that are so upset about it that they're going to give you a ton of pushback are probably not the customers that you're necessarily going to want on the platform anyway. But most people, you find, if they're good users, are going to be more than agreeable to doing something really quick if it means that their accounts are protected.
Yeah, and I will double on that, Stephanie. Your theme over the course of quite a few of your responses has been communication and building, but not just trust with the customers, but essentially recruiting the customers that you want, or the right customers. You do, my advice to everybody is you get the customers you deserve. And if you make it really easy for bad customers to come in, you're going to get bad customers, and then you have to deal with it after the fact. If you're not engaging with people and talking about, hey, we're building this platform for you, ergo we want it to be good for our customers and our drivers and all this stuff. or whoever your folks are in your platforms, then you just run the risk of building a bad starting point. And I think that communication is like the key, and then it becomes an inherent part of your overall approach.
Thank you, Jacob, and thank you all for all of your perspectives. Thank you everyone for joining us today. As a reminder, check out marketplacerisk.com to access this recording along with past recordings and to subscribe to our newsletter to stay up to date on all events and happenings. Wishing everyone a wonderful day and hope to see all of you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.